Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
The great highway of dawn, stretching to slumber, pouring out from her greedy palms ashore to wander, hesitation and doubt, swiftly ensconced. O Viking, your women cannot save you out on this great ship. Time has claimed you, coming for you. That is Bright Flags by Jim Morrison. Hello and welcome to Lux Occult. This is a podcast where we gleefully taunt the mundane, butcher the Latin and most other languages, and we also discuss a variety of magical, occult, and esoteric topics, exploring the intersections of magic, science, art, philosophy, technology, and so much more through the lens of chaos magic. This is occultism for everyone. I'm your host, Lux Estrada, and if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, that means that this show, and magic for that matter, are for you if you want them. There are a lot of different ways to be more free in the world, and using magic or making space for a spiritual practice in your life can be one of them. As always, I don't speak for anybody but myself. People can, will, and should disagree sometimes with the things that I or my guests say on the show. How will we ever learn anything if we were all in agreement on all things after all? And like those who attempt to be reasonable should be willing to do, I can and often do revise my opinions and thoughts about things based on new evidence. Alright, very excited to share an amazing conversation I had with Paul Wyld, author of Jim Morrison, Secret Teacher of the Occult, A Journey to the Other Side, to discuss Jim Morrison, the lead singer of the legendary rock group The Doors, and how he can be thought of as somebody on the same type of spiritual journey that author Manly P. Hall references in his influential classic, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. We get into Jim Morrison's life and career, his music, his persecution and subsequent prosecution by the US authorities, and his tragic later years and somewhat mysterious death. It's a journey that takes us across the world and touches on everything from development of nuclear weapons at Los Alamos to Shakespeare's Hamlet to MK Ultra to Jim's struggles with alcohol and his ill-reputed alter ego Jimbo. We also learn what Jim Morrison can teach us about songwriting and about what it means to walk the path of one of Manly P. Hall's secret teachers. It's a great conversation that I'm really stoked to share with you all. During a break, I'll also do an update about what we have going on the Green Mushroom Project, a large-scale group working which you could be a part of, as well as Void House, our newest adventure, in which we are creating consent-forward or centered spaces in which to conduct magical work, both in person and online, as well as providing consent education to the magically inclined person and investigating the magical healing and alchemical properties of consent. We're also going to hear an original track from Paul Wyld, and after the interview, I will do listener mail and shoutouts, including a look at Freemasonry, which was given in response to the conversation that I had with Tom Banger for the last episode about Temple of Psychic Youth. So we have a lot of great stuff to get into here today. Before we do, let me remind you that if you like the show and the other stuff I've been getting into, you can support it on Patreon. If you do so, you will get a Bibliomancy break with me. There are no tiers or levels or whatever, so give as you will. Buy Me a Coffee is also a rad option for those people who wish to show their support with a one-time donation. I guess there's also a monthly option that is coming now to Buy Me a Coffee, so that is an option as well for the people who don't want to do the Patreon thing. Thank you so much to everybody who has been supporting the show. It makes it possible, literally, by allowing me to cover the expenses associated with making it, thereby justifying to myself the time that I spend. I appreciate the opportunity to be making this thing, and to have the resources necessary to reach y'all is an integral part of that equation, so thank you all so much for making that possible. Although I am a pretty introverted person and I don't use social media very much due to this, I'm not there like checking on stuff every day or anything like that, but it certainly doesn't mean that I don't want to hear from you all or anything like that. I'm beyond lucky to have such amazing listeners, collaborators, cohorts, co-conspirators, etc. I always welcome people's thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revelations. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram for the time being at luxoccultpod. or you can find me on Blue Sky Social at Luxastrata, Luxastrata. All right, allow me to now set the table for today's conversation by giving you all a little bit of context, and then I will introduce my guest. So first of all, let's talk about Jim Morrison, whose full name is James Douglas Morrison. He was born on the 8th of December 1943, died on the 3rd of July 1971. He's an American singer, songwriter, and poet who was the lead vocalist and primary lyricist of the rock band The Doors, as I said. Due to his energetic persona, poetic lyrics, distinctive voice, erratic and unpredictable performances, along with the dramatic circumstances surrounding his life and early death, Morrison is regarded by music critics and fans as one of the most influential frontmen in rock history. Since his death, his fame has endured as one of pop culture's top rebellious and oft-displayed icons, representing the generation gap and youth counterculture. All right, thank you to Wikipedia for that bio. I think that if we look at a lot of the imagery surrounding the Doors, a lot of it does kind of hinge on Jim Morrison as this, sex symbol, really. They're all sexy in black and white with his shirt off in a lot of these pictures and stuff. And I think that looking at the sort of pressure that might put on somebody is part of the conversation that we're going to be having today. So another thing that comes up is this idea of the secret teacher. So we'll talk a little bit real quick about Manly P. Hall, who was the person who wrote the book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He was a Canadian author, lecturer, astrologer, and mystic, born in 1901. Over his 70-year career, he gave thousands of lectures and published over 150 volumes, and The Secret Teachings is the best known of them. In 1934, he founded the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles. So by 1928, Hall had become sufficiently known and respected as an interpreter and lecturer of many ancient writings. He utilized print and word-of-mouth advertising to solicit public funding to finance his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which was published in 1928. He hired John Augustus Knapp to create colorful illustrations and black and white drawings for it. It's pretty cool. I put a link to it in the show notes so people can flip through it and check it out. It's kind of a culty classic. After the Secret Teachings circulated, Hall became increasingly influential on the metaphysical movement sweeping the United States. His book challenges assumptions about society's spiritual roots, making readers view their spirituality in new and diverse ways. He subtitled his book, The Proposition that concealed within the emblematic figures, allegories, and rituals of the ancients is a secret doctrine concerning the inner mysteries of life, which doctrine has been preserved in toto among a small band of initiated minds. That is a hell of a subtitle. All right, thank you, Wikipedia, for that bio. Okay, so we're kind of looking at Jim Morrison through the lens of one of these initiated minds in Manly P. Hall's work with Paul Wyld's book here. So this brings me to introduce Paul himself. So Paul Wyld is a singer-songwriter, artist, poet, and author with a liberal arts degree in history. He lives in Santa Monica, California. And I'm very excited to share our conversation about Jim Morrison and the occult and all of the other interesting sort of fringy conspiracy theory type things that come up in today's conversation. So without further ado, here's the first part of my chat with Paul Wyld. All right, well, my guest today is Paul Wyld. Paul, how's it going?
Good. Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. So I'm so excited to talk about Jim Morrison and your book and all of the rest of it today. Before we get into it, would you mind providing whatever context you would like the listeners and I to know about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm a singer-songwriter. I'm an artist. I live here in California. And when the pandemic hit, everything shut down. There was, no place to go play music, no place to go hang out, nothing. And I had the idea to write this book in the fall of 2019. So when everything happened in March 2020, I thought I'm just going to roll up my sleeves and start writing. And I literally started writing the day the national emergency was declared by the clown that's not going to be in office again. And then the day that I stopped writing in April of 2023, when I told myself I just can't write anymore, that was literally the day that Biden signed into law that ending the national emergency. So it was all kinds of, divine timing that went into writing this book. I could write a book about writing this book.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's so cool. All right. So, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Jim Morrison and like what inspired you to start this project?
I came back to Los Angeles from Boston in 2016, and I was kind of like in a place that's, I guess you can call it like a dark night of the soul kind of thing.
Mm.
I think it was more just, just going to a different phase in life. And I had never really taken a deep dive into the occult before. And it's a subject that has always fascinated me and that I didn't know too much about. But it was always there in the background because I have a deep love of literature and art and film and history, and a lot of the artists and poets and writers that I like a lot, they have real mystical, strong mystical sides to them. And Jim Morrison was one of those people. And I found a book by Gary Lachman called The Secret Teachers of the Western World, which is a really fascinating and thrilling account of Western esoteric tradition. And the more I kept reading this book, which talks all about the various epics in the Western esoteric tradition, which is thousands of years old, and the secret teachers' lives that he goes into, I just kept thinking about Jim Morrison because the descriptions of these people, what these people were about and who they were, their lives, the quality of their lives, the epics that they lived in, their challenges, the persecution that they ran into, that in the general sense, all of them were trying to point us to this other reality that they wanted to make us aware of. I thought, this is who Jim Morrison is. It's like the lights just came on when I read this book, and just inspired me to keep reading more, to keep journaling, to keep writing, to keep searching this out. Till finally, I just decided to write a book about it. I was born in Miami in 1970, on October 7th, and I was born like a mile away from when Jim Morrison was being prosecuted falsely in the Dade County Courthouse. He did not expose himself that night at that concert in Miami, yet he was convicted of it. In 2010, Governor Charlie Crist in Florida got the Florida Clemency Board to finally throw out the charges. He was posthumously exonerated from all of that.
Interesting. I'm sure there was some political stuff surrounding that. I would love to get further into that if you would like to at some point.
Yeah. At that time in Miami, they were looking for any reason, to find a way to put Jim Morrison in jail, to end his career, to just shut down the doors. 5 days after that show, this show was in March 1st, 1969. Then on March 5th, 1969, the FBI sent memos to J. Edgar Hoover's office directly to him. He was the FBI director at that time, a very paranoid, feared man.
Yeah.
This is when Nixon was president.
Yeah, this was an intense kind of group of very paranoid, very intense people, from what I understand historically.
Yes, Nixon was the one who tried to throw John Lennon out of the country when they found out that he was going to go on tour with the likes of people like Abby Hoffman to do an anti-Nixon, anti-war tour. So with Jim Morrison, this is someone who was the eldest son of one of America's, most outstanding military officers. His father was a naval admiral. His father actually, went to the Navy and said, "Listen, I'll resign, my post because my son is an embarrassment." Of course, he never did that. So they were out to get him. And then he was convicted by a 3-woman, 3-man jury in October 1970. The judge on the case, just a few years later, he lost his judgeship because of corruption. And he was not a good guy at all. And then after the concert, there was a rally at the Orange Bowl in Miami, and 30,000 people showed up. It was a conservative rally to protest the Doors concert. The actor Jackie Gleason was there, and Jim Morrison chose to take it a little bit too far. He didn't go as far as they accused him of and charged him of and convicted him of, but he did choose the wrong city to make a big racket on stage that night. Just in my personal experience of growing up in Miami. Miami's a very conservative place. I mean, I'm half Cuban and my family's very Roman Catholic and very conservative. I'm total black sheep, and it's not the place to be doing that. One other person in 1925, you can call him a secret teacher, Paramahansa Yogananda, author of Autobiography of a Yogi. He was on a tour of the United States, and when he came to Miami, they accused him of having a love cult, and they threw him out of the city. So Miami is just not a receptive place for spiritual people of Jim Morrison's type. So they were looking for a way to get him. So I was born, during this, and then growing up in Florida, I lived for a time in Central Florida, not far from where you are, in a town called Enterprise by Lake Sandward. And my high school counselor, he actually went to school with Jim Morrison, and he kind of took an interest in what was going on in my life and gave me a copy of Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine, their compilation album. So, just throughout my life, this just, this love for the Doors and Jim Morrison has sort of been there. I mean, when I read No One Here Gets Out Alive, the first thing that struck me was just how intelligent this person is, just how bright this person is. Like I really enjoyed learning about all of the books that he read. And then I went to those books and poets like Arthur Rimbaud and Friedrich Nietzsche and William Blake and all the people that, we know that Jim Morrison is into, like Antonin Artaud and Norman O'Brown and people like that. And you can receive an entire liberal arts education just by reading these people. And part of the reason why I went to school to study history and literature was because of Jim Morrison. He activated my mind. This person really captures the imagination. And then after school, I went out to California and moved back between California and the East Coast. And then when I got to Los Angeles in 2016, all of the 50th anniversary events were going on with the Doors, around town. So while I was going through my own, personal dark night of the soul / rapid spiritual awakening, these events are going on around town that my friends and I would go to, while I was reading. So it's all quite mysterious. I just finally told myself that, I just kind of sat myself down saying, you have a genuine connection to this. You've discovered something about Jim Morrison that's really amazing and fascinating, and you should write about it. And I was very cognizant of just, how many people love Jim Morrison and the magnitude of the cultural figure that I'm writing about. So I really pushed myself to write, what it is that I want to say, to make a very clear case that Jim Morrison is not only a secret teacher, but he's one of the great ones in the Western esoteric tradition. I was really surprised and just amazed the person that I found, who we all see as, most of the culture just sees as like this, decadent, rambunctious, kind of punk rock star. But there's just so much to this person that is really, really amazing. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours about, this aspect of him. Like the Western esoteric tradition, runs through him, like a great river. And this is a tradition that has so many different tributaries that go off of it, that artistically and intellectually and spiritually, they're very rich, with very long traditions behind those things. And his lyrics and his poetry and the experimental films that he made, a lot of the really astute, very wise, understanding of life that he had in his interviews, it just goes into so many different places.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought up his poetry, because I think for me, even maybe more than his music, that was something that's really influenced me, especially as a young person. I went to like a creative arts, like it was a magnet school for the arts in high school, and I was a creative writing major for that. And I had a book of Jim Morrison's poetry. I think it was called Wastelands or something like that. I don't have it anymore, unfortunately, but this thing, it really had a huge influence on the way that I wrote and thought about the process of writing even. And so yeah, I think Jim Morrison has been a teacher for me in that aspect of my work as well. It's really cool. So you're also a musician, is that right?
Yes.
In what ways do you think you've learned about that from studying Jim's life?
So with his songwriting, from like a Western, to take like an astrological perspective, like Jim Morrison's a Sagittarius. And I've noticed that Sagittarius people are very direct, to the point of being blunt. And a lot of like the best singer-songwriters are Sagittariuses because
I love that Jim Morrison is like, I think that's all bullshit, though. He's like, I'm a Sagittarius, and I think I love that you're bringing that up. I love it. Okay.
Well, because with lyric writing, so poetry is amazing because you could be so creative with words in all kinds of different ways. But when you write songs and lyrics, they have to be as clear as highway signs, for the listener. If you're going to lose the listener, they have to be, very direct, right? And Jim Morrison's songs are like that. They're all very direct, like, break on through to the other side, dig it straight, deep and wide. I mean, a lot of the singer-songwriters that I like, especially people like Alison Mosshart and the Kills and Karen O and the Yeah, Yeah, Yes, et cetera. These Sagittarius types, like they write songs that have a lot of punch to them. So with his lyric writing, I learned to be disciplined about my own lyric writing, because I tend to be more poetic. And you just can't be, kind of like, too flowery with your lyrics. Just compact that song so it really makes an impression in the listener's mind. Like I live here in Los Angeles, and like there's so many great musicians here, and there's so many people here with a lot of talent, with great voices. And a lot of times I walk out of open mics and performances, and I don't remember their songs. And I realize that if you want to do well, with building an audience, with reaching people, like you have to be able to write songs that really stick, in people's minds. Like I use this thing like in that movie Saving Private Ryan at the end where they throw these sticky bombs at the tank, to get the tank to stop and to just like to take the chains off of it. Like that's to me what like rock songs have to be. They've got to be like sticky bombs where you just throw them and they blow up and they just stop a person, like you remember it. To the point where you want to get people when they come to see you, like they know all of your lyrics. I'm a lyric driven songwriter. Like lyrics are really important to me. Mm. And I just want people to come and they want to like sing the song along with you. So that's what I strive to do. That's what I learned from the Doors and a lot of other 60s bands. I went to go see like the Rolling Stones for the first time this past summer twice. And that struck me there too. Like Jim Morrison really, really loved Mick Jagger. Like he thought he was like a prince among men. Then it was amazing to see like this 80-year-old man, like, at the stadium just run around everywhere. Like he's still 20 years old, entertaining like 70,000 people. And then these songs they're still great because they're just so direct. They're just so memorable. And I think also it has a lot to do with, you just got to be yourself. Like you have, that's what I love about Jim Morrison. He was so much about just really find yourself first, and what you're meant to write will come out. So Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth, I think she put it best. Like people don't go to rock shows, necessarily to listen to songs and all that. They go to be around people and see people who believe in themselves. And I think that's like what it's all about. You're going to see people who like they really know who they are. And because of that, by default, they sort of spiritual default, they know what they're meant to express. And that just resonates with people. Like you're going to find your audience. I've noticed like if you go to open mics and, if everybody is clapping for like a person who sings their song and they like it and all that, but another person goes up and they sing and maybe the response is lukewarm, but perhaps you get one or two people that like make the effort to come out of the audience and say, hey, I really like those songs, like your song. That's the person that has more potential to have a music career than the one that, kind of won the whole room with their song. Mm-hmm. If that makes any sense.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, that does make sense. And I think what you're saying about really sort of knowing who you are and expressing that, and that being something that people will connect with, that makes a lot of sense in terms of, I consider some of the work that I do with David Bowie to be like spiritual ancestor work, right? This is somebody who's inspired me a lot. And in terms of like self-expression, I think that's something that I get from him as well. Like he didn't give a flying fuck. He was who he was in all of his weirdness, and he really let that freak flag fly proudly. And so yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of Noel Gallagher in Oasis. I came across this short the other day where, he was saying like, the world didn't want Jimi Hendrix, but they got Jimi Hendrix. The world didn't want Janis Joplin, but they got Janis Joplin. Like, he was like, fuck the audience. Just, do what you're meant to be doing. So with Jim Morrison from high school, so he started journaling in high school. He was very inspired by Franz Kafka, and Franz Kafka, took just copious amounts of journals. So we started doing that in high school, and he kept that up all the way through college and, with the Doors. So for 8 years, he's writing down everything that he's reading. This person had an extraordinary IQ, was 149. So they retained everything that he read. Mm. So he would, write in his journals extensively about what he thought about what he read. He wrote about himself. He was getting to know himself. He wrote down observations about life, about people. He was constantly kind of like, testing and pushing things, with others to see how they would react and what they would do. He was kind of like a mad sociological scientist that way.
He liked to fuck around and find out. Yeah,
exactly. Right. Yeah. And that's right. He had extraordinary curiosity. So by the time he got around to start writing, those songs in 1965, this person had just, more so than anybody, could reach his age 21, 22, had an extraordinary sense of self and who they were. This is like what I've just found absolutely just so remarkable about him. So when he graduates in 1965, he gets his cinematography degree from UCLA. The Doors movie is wrong. He did not drop out and all that. He did graduate. He wanted to go to New York City to work with Jonas Mekas, who's considered the godfather of experimental filmmaking, because he really admired his work. And Jim Morrison saw experimental filmmaking as a kind of alchemy, which you can affect the consciousness, of the viewer with films in a way that to him he saw a relationship with alchemy. And he talks a lot about this in Notes on Vision, the first part of his poetry book, The Lords and the New Creatures. But he decides that he doesn't want to do that because he doesn't want to move to New York City. He doesn't see himself taking care of like equipment and all this kind of stuff. I think also because if you live in New York, you got to get a job, you got to have a place to live and all that. And out here in California, you can sleep on the beaches, which what he ended up doing. And then he was going through a terrible breakup with his girlfriend, Mary Warbelow, that he met in Florida. Jim Morrison really, really loved Mary. Mary had a higher IQ than him. She was more well-read than him. He really loved her. But she told him one day, listen, all you know are books. You need to go find yourself. Also, he was living in his Goshen Avenue apartment here in Westwood by UCLA. And when he graduated, his parents cut him off. They weren't paying the rent and the bills anymore. And I think Mary had the idea that Jim was going to try to move in with her. And she's like, no, that's not going to happen.
Shut it down. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is a super stressful time for him, this transition, all of these structures of support deteriorating.
So he moves down to the beach. I think he just got on the Big Blue Bus here and went down Wilshire Boulevard, and he just started sleeping under the Santa Monica Pier. He was in a lot of pain. I became friends with Bill Cosgrave, who was very good friends with him at that time. He wrote a really cool book called Jim Morrison, Mary and Me. And when he learned of the breakup through Jim, he found him like really, really depressed. Like he was very hurt by that. And The End is inspired originally from their breakup. That's what the song is originally about. He wrote that while he was under the Santa Monica Pier. So at this point, Jim Morrison had already gone through two girlfriends, Tanya Martin in high school, whose mother, told her like, stay away from him. Like he's unclean. Like there's something wrong with him. So that automatically, when you're growing up and you have adults kind of telling, their children who might be dating you or kind of putting that out there about who you are, that kind of does something to your sense of self, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So he's on the beach and Mary rejected him. So this was when he decided that he wanted to meet a woman who was sexually free, very open, very liberal. And of course, Pamela Corson came along about a year later when she came to the Whiskey A Go-Go one night and saw him perform. But when he's on the beach, this is when he makes this decision that a lot of secret teachers have to make. They reach a point in their life where they have to overcome their fear about what other people are going to think about their view of life and what they're meant to express. At the same time that they're overcoming that fear, they are searching for a way to express their connection to that other reality. And they become outsiders. Jim Morrison loved this book by Colin Wilson called The Outsider when he was in high school. And this is Colin Wilson's classic study of the Romantics. And Colin Wilson was very interested in why these Romantics had these high experiences called what he called peak experiences. Mm-hmm. And then they had these dramatic drops, these lows, in which they become suicidal. They would turn to alcohol and get hooked on drugs and all that kind of stuff. And Jim Morrison paid close attention to this book. Jim Morrison was a classic romantic. He was looking for a way to express what he felt, because Jim Morrison was a very, very sensitive person, with like an extraordinary like depth of feeling and intelligence, about a lot of artistic things that were very prevalent at that time, with modernism, starting like with symbolism, with experimental filmmaking and surrealism and abstract expressionism. He really loved, he hated Hollywood. That was not an option for him. He did not want to do that. He told his friend Bill Cosgrave he thought Hollywood was syrup for the masses. Jim Morrison loved French New Wave films. He loved that film Contempt by Godard, like he loved Francois Truffaut. And so there wasn't really that kind of film climate after he graduated from UCLA to go into Hollywood. He didn't really want to do that. So he got the idea that rock and roll would be a novel way to express himself. And that makes him like a really true artist because like he said that rock and roll coincided, with his coming of age. And, rock music was very new back then. So for someone as creative as Jim Morrison, it was a really brilliant idea. He could do all these new things, marrying, poetry with rock music and with blues with this brand new art form that was just, it was only about 10 years old and been only about 10 years since Elvis came out. Jim Morrison really loved Elvis, by the way.
Another very occulty, I think, secret teacher as well, Elvis. A lot of people don't realize the extent to which he had a lot of interesting spiritual shit going on. Very cool.
Oh, it's amazing. So Miguel Connor, I was on his podcast AM Bite. He sent me his galley for his book, The Occult Elvis, and I've been reading through it. And wait till people learn about this. I was really amazed. When I went to go see the movie, I had a suspicion that he was very much influenced by the blues and like a really sensitive person, a very spiritual person in his own way. And the film, I felt really bad for this guy in the way that they pushed him. Jim Morrison went through the same thing. They pushed him too. And Jim Morrison also, he loved blues. When he was a teenager, he would haunt the blues joints outside of Washington, D.C. And he loved to just go hang out with the black men who were fishing out by the pier, off in Alexandria. Like, he identified, with a lot of African American culture. Actually, and also a lot of people don't know this. And I know I'm going like all over the place with this. When you talk about Jim Morrison, you end up just like, it's just like almost impossible to focus on one thing. It just goes everywhere. So he was drinking at his favorite bar, Barney's Beanery in West Hollywood. This is when he was with the Doors and famous. And Jerry Hopkins was his good friend who later on co-wrote with Danny Sugarman, No One Here Gets Out Alive. And he told Jerry Hopkins, like, I would love to see a biography, about Elvis. And that inspired Jerry Hopkins to write the very first biography called Elvis: A Biography, which came out in 1971. I thought that was a pretty cool anecdote.
That's cool.
So yeah, Jim Morrison really loved Elvis, and Elvis was a very spiritual person. Everyone's going to find that out with Miguel Connor's book. But to go back to his time on the beach, so he was a classic romantic, an outsider, a secret teacher looking for a way to express, his deep connection to that other reality. That's why I chose to open this book with that quote from his poetry. Reality is what has been concealed from us for so long. And Jim Morrison just gave his soul and his life and his mission, his art over to ripping away the veil, tearing the veil from, this spiritual world that he really, really felt was a place that we'd have a lot of healing, where we would bring balance, back to our lives. With music, with celebration of, with art and with all of those things. He really believed in his healing powers, which goes to his whole shamanistic side, as well. This is very interesting. When one night, John Densmore, this is during time when John Densmore and Robbie Krieger, the two other members of the band, were sharing a home in the Hollywood Hills. Jim Morrison, one evening, was very suicidal, and they spent the whole night trying to talk him out of committing suicide. You can learn about this. It's a video that's on YouTube called Jim Morrison, An Hour for Magic. It's very revealing. And Robert Creary says that they had to do that, a few times with him, and that they spent the night doing this, and that towards the end of the night, Jim Morrison decided to take a walk, and he went out for a walk in the Hollywood Hills, and he came back when the sun came up in a completely different mood. The person that wanted to take his life had completely disappeared. He was very euphoric. And he came back with the entire melody and all the lyrics written out for People Are Strange.
Wow.
Which is absolutely remarkable.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like this idea of really having to kind of like go down to the depths to find this thing to take back with you, this song or piece of art. I can relate with some of that actually in my own creative process. Maybe not to the extent that Jim experienced it, but that sounds familiar.
Yeah, yes, I can relate too. Well, when I heard that in the interview, I thought, now I know why he loved Colin Wilson's The Outsiders so much, because that's how those artists were. Colin Wilson talks about Van Gogh. The Starry Night, like that's an expression of a peak experience. Peak experiences are these overwhelming, feelings of being very much in touch with reality when the world is so vibrant and brilliant. Mm-hmm. And Van Gogh was the kind of artist who his peak experiences with people like Van Gogh and Jim Morrison. They're like, we all have peak experiences, first of all. It's in John Steinbeck's East of Eden, where he says you can judge a man by how many, glories that he's had in his life. Glories being those moments when you just feel everything is just right. What G.K. Chesterton called the absurd good news. But peak experiences I've learned with people like Van Gogh and Jim Morrison, these types of artists, they're like Himalayan peak experiences. They're just very rich, filled with depth, and they're, with such sensitive people. And when you combine that with people who have also like the talent and the ability to express that, like Van Gogh and Jim Morrison, then you get fantastic art. So it's no wonder Jim Morrison, really loved Colin Wilson's The Outsider. He makes it a point. Colin Wilson makes a point that with The Starry Night, that's Van Gogh's, one of Van Gogh's best expressions of like, one of the many peak experiences that he had. But then a year later, after painting this beautiful painting, Van Gogh, he killed himself. Mm-hmm. And on his suicide note, he wrote, misery just goes on and on. Life is just filled with misery. It's the same outlook on life that Jim Morrison had. We hear that in his poetry album, American Prayer. Could any hell be more horrible than now and real? And that's how Jim Morrison saw life too. So, to go back to the beach when he's under the pier and he's right in the end and he's going through this breakup and all that, like it's a very, very complicated time because he's putting himself through, he's going through rapid spiritual awakening, first of all. We haven't even talked about like in the Native American workers, and they were dying, the accident he came upon in 3, that Jim Morrison said that they had leapt into his soul and stayed there, which is one way in which what I learned from shamanism, archaic techniques of ecstasy, Barbara Chi Eliot, that's one way in which a person knows that they're going to be a shaman later in life, is that a spiritual indwelling occurs from people who might have been shamans or were shamans at the point of their death. It's that whole thing in New Mexico, we can get into that, but that's like, it's very complicated. There's absolutely nothing, everything about Jim Morrison's life is very complicated, very mysterious, and really strange.
Yeah, so, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was going to ask, this was just one of the questions on the list that I had to ask. I'm curious what you think Jim Morrison, having had these experiences, these connections with people who were more disenfranchised and stuff. I'm curious what you think he might think about movements like the land back efforts and things like that.
Oh, I think he would be all for that. I think he would be right there with all of those people involved in all those things, like the Keystone Pipeline and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, let's go there for a second. So in New Mexico, when he's 3 years old, he's out there driving with his family. They're on like a day vacation kind of thing. His father is stationed in Mexico, and there is a traffic accident with Native workers, and they died on the scene. And like I said, Jim Morrison said that he felt that was the most important experience of his life when those souls leaped out and leapt into his. Now, from my research, it's that whole event and where it took place, the land there in New Mexico, and what was going on and who those people were is a really, really critical part to Jim Morrison's story. The Los Alamos National Laboratory, where like the birthplace of the atomic bomb, mm-hmm. That used to be called the Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys before Robert Oppenheimer in General Groves turned that place into where they would have the Manhattan Project, and then it became a permanent installation, Los Alamos National Laboratory. We built our first ICBMs and all that kind of stuff. Now, the natives in the area, they knew that something was going on there that was top secret. Of course, they didn't know what, but they were told that they were not going to be there for very long because the Manhattan Project, took up a lot of land to do this. Mm-hmm. But when they found out that it was going to be a permanent installation, like they were not happy about that at all, especially when they found out like what they were doing there. Like they're building these first weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. And it's just at the very least, the complete opposite of what, the natives in the area were all about, in the spiritual sense. Right.
Yeah. And it's I could see that being like such a fucking nightmare to have like your home taken away for that purpose. Right. Like that's deep,
Yeah. And I included an article in the first part of my book, about this. So the natives in the area were employed to work at Los Alamos to build it. And that traffic accident, I found the newspaper article about it. Like these workers were on their way to work, the future Los Alamos National Laboratory. So yes, it was called the Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys, and Robert Oppenheimer went there. And when General Groves asked him to, figure out a place to, get down to the business of, building an atomic weapon, Oppenheimer remembered that school And he went to New Mexico, told General Goes, this is the place where he wants to do it. The U.S. government came in. They said, we're going to buy this area. I think, habeas corpus type stuff and all that. And the school was shut down. Strangely, William S. Burroughs, Jim Morrison's favorite writer who wrote Naked Lunch, he loved that book. He was a student there also before Robert Oppenheimer. And William S. Burroughs prided himself in this rebellious way of having gone to the school that the U.S. government bought out, to build an atomic weapon. Also, during that time, and when this happened, when Jim Morrison was on the road with his family, Jack Kerouac was wrapping up the hitchhiking trip that inspired him to write On the Road at that same time. And Jim Morrison said later on that The Doors is not possible if he had never read Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So there's all kinds of mysterious, synchronicities going on here, all at once. This also brings up Hamlet. And I kept thinking about Hamlet in this story, because in the play Hamlet, this kind of predates modern man by 300 years, because Hamlet is someone who discovers the spiritual world. His mother and his uncle conspire to kill his father to become, king and queen of Denmark. And Hamlet is plunged into this horrific grief, the loss of his father. Horatio comes to him saying, there's a ghost. It's your father's ghost. And the ghost meets Hamlet, tells him what happened. And of course, Hamlet is furious and enraged. But at the same time, Hamlet is also energized and he's awakened and he's enthusiastic. He goes to Horatio and says, there are more things in this world that are dreamt of in your philosophy. And then he tells Horatio this extraordinary statement. He says, let's give it a welcome. Let's not turn it away. Let's give it a welcome. And Horatio is warning at the same time, but this can draw you into madness. And of course, in the end, in a way, it does. And here with Jim Morrison's case, you have these spirits, these souls that leap into these Native American people, this person who is the eldest son of one of America's most outstanding military officers, who goes down this road in life where, he becomes the champion of a lot of a kind of spirituality that's very much in line with who the Native Americans were, to go back to the land, as you were saying. And he becomes a Hamlet figure and just kind of get back in that, I don't want to say a revengeful way, but to take back spiritually, what belongs to us, that comes through Mother Earth. And that comes through a lot of his songs, and When the Music's Over, ravished and plundered, ripped her and bit her, stuck her with nails in the side of the dom, tied her with fences and dragged her down. It's one of the first expressions of what we've done, to the earth. So to go all the way back to what you're originally saying about your question, with the land, Jim Morrison absolutely would have been all about, the land back movement, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, fuck yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned that you wanted to talk about was the idea that Jim Morrison might have been somehow involved in MK Ultra, which is a fascinating, part of history in general. We could go down a long rabbit hole just talking about the history there. This is one of my topics of interest for sure, as I think a lot of my listeners as well. So I'm curious, could you provide a little bit of context about what those what kind of stories surround that relationship and what your thoughts are about that?
Yeah, it's a very important question, because I'm getting so many comments and emails and stuff in relation to another book by a man, last name McGowan, I don't know the first name, called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which goes into, I'm not an expert I know about MK Ultra, but I'm not as deep into it as a lot of people are, but I can speak intelligently to an extent with Jim Morrison. So MK Ultra was, as we all know, was this program that was exposed in the 70s that was trying to experiment with how to create, mind-controlled assets of the government in all these different various ways, through creating, I think it was mostly based on traumatizing individuals to be able to get into their minds and take advantage of something called dissociation.
Yeah, there was this notion that you could create something called psychic driving, and there was some pretty fucked up experiments carried out along these lines on American citizens without their consent by our government. So yes, this was something that went on for quite a while, and has a very rich and fascinating history that people can look into. There's a couple of documentaries about it and several podcasts and all kinds of stuff. But okay.
While psychic driving, that's a new phrase that's frightening.
Yeah, it's very dark and fucked up once you look into it for sure.
So this is really cool. There's a part of Los Angeles where I like to, go have coffee and stuff. And I made a friend. He said, I work out with this guy, his name is Tom, and he wrote this really great book that's popular in the culture right now called Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the secret history of the 1960s. And I didn't know about this book at all. And he wanted us to meet. And then I got a curiosity. I got online and saw that, he was on like Joe Rogan getting interviewed about his book. And I was like, wow, this guy's got like 4 or 5 million views here. And I read his book, and I think Tom O'Neill has probably like the most mature, most responsible understanding of how to approach the subject of MK Ultra and what he found out about Charles Manson and the trial surrounding the Tate LaBianca murders. So one night I was in Hollywood, and I was taking the bus back home because I don't have a car right now. At the time, I didn't have a car, and I was at a bus stop, and there was one person there by themselves, and I kept looking at them like, I kind of think that's Tom O'Neill. And I went up to him and said, are you Tom? And he's like, yeah. And so that's how we ended up meeting. And then we agreed that, like our meeting was meant to be. And he told me that he also gets a lot of questions about McGowan's book, Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine. And just for the viewers, this book is popular with a lot of people who are into 60s music because I read the book, and I think it's a flimsy argument. There's a lot of guilt by association kind of things going on here, but there's no real evidence. There's no real line of proving anything about how singer-songwriters living in Laurel Canyon were colluding with the United States government with their artwork to somehow mind control their audiences to do things, or whatever that they wanted to do. Like there's just no fire there. It's just a lot of smoke that kind of makes it interesting and suspicious. But Jim Morrison was absolutely not an MK Ultra, mind controlled, asset placed in the music industry, by the American military establishment.
I'm not sure that anybody was that, Paul. I'm not sure that anybody was. I don't know.
So it's like, but a lot of people, they just sort of think this because of this book, and I'm rather surprised by all of this. So Tom's book goes into Charles Manson having been he was in prison for about 7 years, in federal prison in the 60s, and that he made a lot of his handlers in prison, like his counselors and people like that, they turned out to be people who were in the CIA, who were involved in all of the things that were going on with MK Ultra when a lot of those documents were released in the 70s, all these individuals. And that when Charles Manson was released, and he was in San Francisco going to these clinics and all that, like his counselors and his parole officers and all of them, they were also people who were once in the CIA involved, connected with all this MK Ultra stuff. And they were the ones who approved him when he asked to go down to Los Angeles because he wanted to get into the music industry. A lot of people don't know that, Neil Young tried to get Charles Manson signed to his record label. He thought like Charles Manson was was really talented, had something to offer.
There was a member of the Beach Boys who was kind of loosely associated with his kind of crew for a little while too, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. Yes. There was I think Charles Manson was living in someone's house, and it was owned by someone in the Beach Boys.
Okay.
And something went on. Charles Manson was arrested, and then, mysteriously he was released. He wasn't put back in prison because he violated his parole. When Tom put in all these FOIA requests, the 2 times that Charles Manson was arrested and released, he should have been put back into prison. But it turns out there was other arrests that we don't know about, in which, he absolutely should have been put back in prison, but was just mysteriously just let go.
Mm.
So but Tom makes the very responsible, point that all of these things, they point to something that is quite possible, but we just don't really know.
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibilities for you've got this group of people who are interested in investigating mind control tactics, right?
Hmm.
Having somebody who is, doing this cult experiment or whatever we want to call it, that seems like something that they might have been interested in watching. Whether or not the people knew that they were involved with it, because I think a lot of times when we look at the MK Ultra stuff, and I'm sure other things as well, but a lot of the people that were like involved with it didn't know that that's what they were involved with because there were so many different like shells and other names and things around it too. So it's kind of like hard to trace down, and it's possible that we may never like be able to know. But I could see that being within the realm of possibilities, just in terms of like what would make sense.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you completely. Like, we're going to continue, to find out as the years go on, more and more, get to like, this truth. It's like this onion that we keep peeling about all this. It's really fascinating. We have to remember this goes into LSD. So when LSD, came out about 10 years later, the CIA tried to use LSD for as a truth serum.
Hmm.
And it just totally backfired on them. Like their agents who agreed to like, to be test subjects, like, they had these beautiful experiences and decided they didn't want to be in the CIA anymore and left. So
Yeah, some of them were like assassinated because of this. It got
Mhm.
pretty wild. Like, yeah, for sure.
And so that didn't work. Interesting. I don't remember his name, but America's top World War II spy, he saw the healing and spiritual potentials of LSD, and he actually like went around the country with the people that he knew saying, listen, you've got to try this. Like, this is really going to help you. One of those people was the actor Cary Grant. With him, Cary Grant, he tripped on acid about 60 times. And he said it really helped his life. He really healed. They were also in Canada, they were using it to treat depressed alcoholics. And it completely turned their lives around. They just did not go back to drinking at all. So it goes from the CIA trying to use it from a truth serum all the way to October 6, 1966, like when you could buy it, over the counter, which is what Jim Morrison was doing at Venice Beach when they completely outlawed it, and they scheduled it as a drug that's, illegal. And I'm inclined to believe that one of the reasons that they were doing that is LSD in conjunction with, proper set and setting, for therapeutic uses. You could probably put the cigarette and alcohol, industry right out of business with all of that. I mean, because, LSD can be a very healing thing in people's lives. I mean, this it's tricky. Like
Yeah.
LSD is like, it's like landing on the moon for a person's life. And, I'm very fortunate. I guess I've never had like a bad trip experience, so to speak. I mean, I've been in places, I've done it, I've done it a bunch of times myself. And I came to a point in my life where, okay, I don't need to be doing this anymore. And I'm like, oh my God, I've
Mhm.
got 15 hours ahead of me of this, right? But I've never really had like a psychotic episode. I've seen people have that. And then I've seen people come out of those psychotic episodes and their lives have changed. Like something actually healed them. It's almost as if the LSD, which I consider like a non-specific amplifier of things that are going on in your unconscious and your psyche, they come up because your those mind forged manacles in your mind, they're open. And for a lot of people, you're confronting a lot of very, very deep things that are going on in your life, and they can be traumatic.
Yeah.
It's, you know,
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think yeah, this it's a powerful like it's I like the idea of this like relationship between poison and medicine. And like oftentimes something can be either poison or medicine depending on in what way it's used and what dosage and all of the rest of it, right? So it's something that's powerful like that. It can do so much to expose us to new perspectives. My experiences with it have opened up a lot for me in terms of like ontological suspicions about like the reality we live in and really cool and interesting things like that have been like really meaningful things that I feel really grateful for. I've also known people who, didn't know that they had schizophrenia before trying LSD and then really going down, a bad path because of maybe that choice. It's hard to say with this stuff, but that kind of coinciding and so yeah, it's something that it can really go a lot of different ways for people. And I think for myself at least, I always approached it with like a lot of respect as like, a sort of a foreign entity, if you will, of like a teacher that, I would show up with respect to. And I think that probably what I would consider to be a healthy attitude because It can be really powerful. It can do a lot of stuff for better or possibly for worse, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. I have the same attitude about kind of like a sacred way of looking at LSD. Just, I mean, the story of LSD, there's a really great book called Acid Dreams that I mentioned to you. You know, we first it's synthesized in 1938, and then in Sandoz Laboratories and Albert Hoffman, he puts it on the shelf. They tried to do some things with it, and it doesn't really work. And then in 1943, he takes it down, and some of it accidentally douses on his hand, and then he has a very interesting bike ride back home.
It's bicycle day.
Yeah, it's bicycle day. Right. Interesting enough, like this happens in 1943, the year Jim Morrison's born. And like I say in my book, like in the same month, in the same year, April 1943, that's when Robert Oppenheimer is in New Mexico convening all the scientists to begin the Manhattan Project, to create the first atom bomb. I'm a spiritual person, so I look at life, especially now, after being awakened, et cetera, and so forth. I don't look at life in a natural way anymore. I look at life from a supernatural perspective, from a spiritual perspective, and I just almost feel like the divine was like, okay, if you guys are going to build a weapon of mass destruction, which you can destroy yourselves in a matter of 72 minutes, then here's something that's going to help speed along people to open up to the infinite, and so they can know everything that you're going to lose, and also to just really push people into a place where you can become a spiritual person. You can see the richness and beauty and the infinity of life. It's not to say that LSD is like instant enlightenment, instant spiritual awakening, instant recognition of one's divine spark within and the oneness and the beauty and all of that. That, of course, that's not the truth, but it's definitely something that came into existence at a very mysterious point in time, right smack in the middle, also in this neutral nation in the middle of World War II, that helps a lot of people to become better people. So many people, after their LSD experiences, they either become devout Christians, or they become Buddhists, or they wake up to spirituality. They get into all kinds of other things that have nothing to do with 3D consciousness. Like, there's a lot of cosmic consciousness involved with this. They become people who want to protect the environment. They go into nonprofit work. It's a life-changing experience. And from what I've read, it's mostly, quite positive. The negative things I've read about it have come from the very, hard right establishment that I think that comes from a place where they are terrified that they're going to lose control of the narrative over how they want people in society to think with their idea about how a country is supposed to keep itself together with people. That's one of the reasons why they went after Jim Morrison, because he was so powerful with who he was. This person is just like all the other past great secret teachers. He's a rock star, affecting a change in consciousness, with America's baby boomers. They paid really close attention to this. This goes back to Hamlet, when the king is like, madness and great ones must not unwatched go. That was never more true for someone, like Jim Morrison. So with LSD, I think it just came about in a way at a time when we needed something like that to help us along. That's how I see LSD.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Foxtrot 3, Romeo 2, 4, Yankee, Romeo 7, Bravo, Delta, Quebec.
Greetings, it is I, Luxa from the future. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. We're going to be getting back to the rest of my chat with Paul Wyld here soon to talk more about Jim Morrison. I'll ask Paul about Jim's struggles with alcohol after the break, and we'll get into the tragic later years of his life and his somewhat mysterious death as well. One takeaway that I got from this part is that going to Paris might not be the best way to regain your health. After the interview, we'll get into some fun listener mail and shoutouts, including some commentary about Freemasonry. And we're also going to hear one of Paul Wyld's songs here to take us back into the interview. But now, let me go ahead and share a quick update about the Green Mushroom Project and what we have going on there. So this is an ongoing group magical working based on the metaphor of the relationship that some fungi share with some plants. In a nutshell, if we the magical practitioners of the project are like a forest of trees, the green mushroom current, which connects us and strengthens us, in unseen ways is its counterpart in that metaphor. In addition to the mycelial web, which connects us, there's also the idea of the mushroom spores, which are a more celestial way this current moves. These can be thought of as little packets of the current's energy, which can be applied to situations as needed by any participant. So the Green Mushroom Project's newest experiment, Void House, is about investigating the healing and alchemical properties of consent, and the idea that the magical will is really wrapped up in all of this in interesting ways. Providing consent education to magically inclined people and organizing consent-forward or centered magical spaces for group work both in person and online is also part of this. We have a lot of fun and free activities going on the Green Machine Discord server, which is the home of the Green Machine Hyposigil Project and Void House. Join us for our weekly Fungal Friday chats, as well as special events like ceremonies and seasonal celebrations. There's also several educational opportunities available. Check out the Lux Occult YouTube channel to watch a presentation that Dave Neal and I recently gave about trauma-informed practices and about ways that understanding this stuff can allow for more consensual interactions in daily life and also can help you sort of understand what's going on with yourself and those around you better. It's really informative and interesting and helpful information to have, so that's out there if you're interested. We're also gathering submissions for our third offering of collected work, Fuck Around and Find Out Part 3, Sorceress Recipes for Resistance, Resilience, and More from the Green Mushroom Project. So we're collecting recipes from anything to essential oil blends, to soups, to incenses, to whatever other recipes that you might use in your magical practice. Check out the link in the show notes to get some guidelines about that. The deadline to submit is February 14th, so do not delay. As always, much love and much love to everybody participating in the Green Mushroom Project, regardless of what that looks like for you in your practice. It's been such an honor and such a privilege to be sharing this journey with you all and to see how it's unfolded in all of its different ways. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or get me on Blue Sky at luxestrada for a link to the Discord server. You can also find me for the time being on Instagram at luxoccultpod. All right, I'll be back after the interview to share some listener mail, including some commentary about Freemasonry. There's actually a lot of really cool stuff to get into there, but now, leading us back into the rest of my conversation with Paul Wyld is his track, 123 California. Much love and solidarity to everybody impacted by the fires out there. Please stay safe.
One, two, three, California, woods and wolves, Transylvania, lost and alone, now the sand is my home, with the sun and all of the fun. 1, 2, 3, California, swamps and snakes, Louisiana, drunk and high like all the birds in the sky. I crawl away inside. Sing to me, O ghosts of the sea, your face I've seen on the moon. Take me away on a great bird of prey, to my home, my life, and my love. One, two, three, California, Something's wrong, though I adore ya. But woe unto thee with your streets and your dreams that seem to guide me with ease. So sing to me, O ghosts of the sea. Your face I've seen on the moon. Take me away on a great bird of prey to my home, my life and my love. My home, my life and my love. But woe unto thee with your streets and your dreams that seem to guide me with ease. And sing to me, O ghosts of the sea. Your face I've seen on the moon. Take me away on a great bird of prey to my home, my life and my love. My home, my life and my love. My home, my life and my love.
One of the things that I was hoping to ask about too, and I'm curious what your opinion is here, because I know we've heard about the ways that Jim Morrison has been sort of persecuted by the government and others, throughout his life, and some of the inaccuracies that have come up in your, looking at his biography and everything. One of the things that people bring up about his life is that he sometimes struggled pretty hard with alcohol. And at times this could be something that would make his behavior like hard to be around, that he could sometimes be abusive when he was drinking. I'm wondering to what extent you found that to be like accurate, or was that, just not accurate, or I'm sure there's maybe somewhere in the middle as well. Everybody who has trauma and who has complications, they have some way of kind of coping with that. And oftentimes substance use is one of those things that we see being one of those coping mechanisms. So yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, great question. Great place to go. So yeah, Ray Manzarek said that when Jim Morrison drank, another side of him came out that Ray Manzarek called Jimbo. And a lot of people weren't very happy with Jimbo. He could be abusive at times. Sometimes he could be sadistic. He was someone who at that time with the Doors is separate from everything going in the 60s, peace, love, and brotherhood and oneness and all that. The Doors is different. The Doors is like this great big band all about shadow work. And Jim Morrison was exploring the dark side of life. So things were dark. And when he drank, things got dark. With Jim Morrison, with who he was, with his sensitive who he was, with his volatile as who he was, with the times that he was living in, with his Dionysian, personality and his archetype, alcohol is just throwing, high-powered gas, onto the bonfire. Mm-hmm. And since he did have a Dionysian archetype, which is why I brought that up in the book, it's a typical trait of a person with that kind of personality to want to heighten their experiences of consciousness and their peak experiences and sexuality, etc., with psychedelics, with drugs, with alcohol. Plus, Jim Morrison, his original ambition was to be a writer and a filmmaker, and alcohol just sort of kind of like goes along with that, right?
I've heard whiskey being called writing juice before, so yes.
Oh, really? That's a new one, writing juice. I like that. But I've learned to be sympathetic about Jim Morrison's drinking. That's a big topic with all of them with him. So Robbie Krieger staged an intervention with Jim Morrison during the Doors, which lasted about 2 weeks. They got together. They said, "You got a drinking problem. You got to stop. We're worried about you." Robbie Krieger even had his father, talk to him about it. And he went on the wagon for 2 weeks and then fell off, after a while. And Robert Krieger makes the point where back then, this is the 1960s. This is a Dionysian time. Nobody wants to leave the party, right? We're all young and we're all, successful rock stars, and this is Los Angeles, and all this is going on, and it's hard to stop the party. Plus, also, I didn't have the Betty Ford Clinic to take Jim Morrison to. There was absolutely nothing in the medical industry, and in the psychiatric industry that was set up to deal with famous people who had a drinking problem. And we did our best in our own ways. It disgusted John Densmore, because John Densmore was tired of the concerts being interrupted by his drinking and his tirades, etc. And that was the beginning of John Densmore's kind of going his own way from the band. With Ray Manzarek, he has this story where they were staying at a hotel in New York, and in the evening he was drinking with Jim Morrison at the bar. And then about 10 o'clock, Ray was like, okay, I can't drink anymore, I'm going to bed. And he came downstairs from his hotel at about 11 o'clock in the morning. They said Jim Morrison was still there at the bar drinking. He was just like he just couldn't believe it. And that's when Ray Manzarek was like, my God, like, geez, this guy really is, of Irish, like cut from something Irish and Scottish. Like and he was perfectly, coherent and talking to people. That's who Jim Morrison was. This person had a very strong constitution. Jim Morrison could do the butterfly stroke with ease. That's really, really hard. He was tough. He had the physical stamina, to be a rock star, and he also had the physical stamina, to be a shaman. Like the copious amount of drugs he would do to break on through the other side. Like, if any of us did the amount of LSD that he did that summer in 1965 and through 67, we would all be in a mental asylum. Like, it's just too much. It's amazing that he could withstand all of that. But with his drinking, also Frank Lissandro, his UCLA film school friend that stayed with him throughout his life. Frank Lissandro would turn out to be a really great friend. He put together this book called Friends Gather Together, which is always like interviews of people that knew Jim Morrison personally, which I think is probably a really great book about him, one of the best. Jim Morrison told him one day, he said, look, I drink to shut the demons up in my mind. Like, they're driving me to create. Like, I can't shut them up. Drinking shuts them up. Or we could also call them, daemons. I think they're the Greek sense of the term. They're interchangeable, right? So there are a lot of, different reasons why Jim Morrison drank. I think when you really look at what was going on with him towards the end of the Doors, when he's out there on Santa Monica Boulevard, where Frank Lissandro says, like, you can find him, like, sitting in bars and cafes, scribbling away in his notebooks, talking to himself with a beard that made it look like Allen Ginsberg. Jim Morrison loved Allen Ginsberg. His face is plastered all over the 6 o'clock news all over America because of the Miami trial. Also because of a trial in Phoenix, Arizona, since him and his friend Tom Baker were arrested for like disrupting a flight. Also your girlfriend Pamela Curson, she's hooked on heroin, which Jim Morrison did not like at all, and he was putting thousands of dollars into her boutique, Themis, which you can imagine where that was going with when your girlfriend's like, hooked on heroin all the time and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Plus he's it's tragic. It's a tragic scene there. And then also you're under pressure. You have to figure out how to stay creative. If you're Jim Morrison, everybody's expecting you to stay, this high octane, super original creative artist. And he was really struggling with how he was going to do that. So the drinking was probably to relieve the pressure. I know that this is like the one thing that was very difficult for me to stomach with Jim Morrison, and I almost did give up writing just because of this, is because there was an incident where he was at his home in Laurel Canyon, where he lived with Pamela, where Janis Joplin was a guest at his house one night. They're all drinking and having a great time and all that. And during the party, Jim Morrison, in front of everybody, he started in on Janis Joplin and he hit her. And of course, that infuriated and saddened Janis Joplin. Like, there's someone that didn't need any more bullshit in her life, right?
For real, yeah.
So she went out to her car and was going to go away. And Jim Morrison felt very bad for what he did, and he went out into the driveway. He stuck his head into the driver's side window where she was, and
now he's trying to keep her from leaving.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
God, yeah, like, yikes. Okay.
They tried, and he was apologizing her too profusely, but Janis Joplin took one of her Southern Comfort bottles and just smashed it over his head and just called him a fucking dickhead and drove the fuck off. And I'm like, good for you.
Yeah,
and
right on, Janis.
Then Jim Morrison was really impressed by that. And next day he went to Paul Rothschild, their producer, said, listen, like, I really want like Janis Joplin's phone number. Like, I really like her. And Paul Rothschild said, listen, man, like they don't ever want to see you again. Like, don't go there. You're going to get yourself arrested. And Jim Morrison was depressed for a solid month, according to Paul Rothschild near the doors, because Janis Joplin wanted nothing to do with him. Serves him right, you know.
Yeah, and that's too bad. I think that we could kind of look at that as an instance where this person's drinking ruined what could have been a fun friendship for him, you know? So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And you know, if you're familiar with Janis Joplin's life, I mean, you know, so many people were so mean to her, you know, before her fame and then during her fame. I mean, you know, she had the indignity of like, she was so happy to meet one of the best journalists in the New York Times. He wanted to meet her and do a story about her. And he was just so rude to her, like insinuating, like, you know, why do you think someone like you who looks like you became a rock star? Like, who do you think you are? That kind of thing. Janis Joplin dealt with this like so much.
Yeah.
So that's a part of Jim Morrison that was hard. Like I was afraid. I'm like, okay, if I write a book about Jim Morrison, like everybody finds this out about it, I'm gonna get hated. I was like, I really like, but I told myself, look, if you judge him, you're not gonna have a book. You know, if you go to all these really, really amazing things about who he was. I mean, he was such a cool person. And when he was back to his normal, polite, generous self, you know, he was one of those people that you just kind of end up forgiving just because you liked him that much. That's what everybody, you know, seems to say in their interviews about him. And that they would tell him what he was doing when he was drunk. And then he would, in a very genuine way, according to their accounts, he'd be like, wow, like, I'm really, really sorry. Like, that's really, really terrible, you know? So this whole other personality named Jimbo came out when he was drunk, and it really damaged his reputation, both during his time and with his legacy. Like towards the end, a lot of people, he was not a cool person towards the end before he left for Paris. He was overweight. He wasn't looking very good anymore. He wasn't really taking care of himself. He was drinking too much, and he could be seen passed out drunk in the gutter in front of the Whiskey A Go-Go. And a lot of Los Angeles' like, you know, really hip, cool, smart music scene wanted nothing to do with him after that. They didn't want to deal with that. It's very sad. This is when the story gets really hard. You know, it gets really tragic with the drinking.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can take away from that. I think we probably all have our own version of Jimbo that comes out in certain circumstances for ourselves. And like, that's one of the demons that we are required to tangle with sometimes. And yeah, it can be very difficult sometimes, I think, especially under circumstances of pressure. And this is something that comes up so much with just talking about people's lives who are famous, and like this idea that fame can be a sort of abuse where people are not afforded the privacy that, you know, people need for like mental health and stuff like that. And so yeah, it's really complicated, as you said.
Yeah. Like there's this, I found a video in which this lady who worked with the Doors, I think she was a secretary, like she was going to have dinner with her family one night in the Valley, and Jim Morrison really wanted to join her, but she was very reluctant to say yes because she didn't know what her family would think bringing Jim Morrison home, because they would recognize him from all the crazy news stories about his life and the arrests and all that kind of stuff. But she relented, and he went, and there's all these beautiful pictures of Jim Morrison sitting around with her family and the kids. And you can tell, like, he just wants to feel like a human being. Like, he just wants to be around a family, you know? The only time he ever really had that was with his sister and his brother. He didn't have a close relationship with his father because his father's very different from him and was away at sea a lot. Clara Morrison, she did her best. She was a good mom, was a nuclear family, but she married a military man. She did not marry an artist. And on top of that, your son is Jim Morrison. Like that was a hard relationship. There's no way that mother and son understood each other, or that, you know, I think his mom did the best that she could. I think if Jim Morrison had lived, on that note, there would have been a reconciliation between him and his parents, because all three of them were reasonable, sensible, kind, generous people in the end. So in this video, she talks about this, you know, in these pictures, you can see Jim Morrison, like, you know, gosh, if this guy would have gotten this together, he would have been, you know, a good husband and a good father if he had gotten past all his demons and grown up that way. So but the final thing with the drinking is that I think in the end, when he was in Paris, the idea was to go to Paris and really get himself together. He wanted to, well, he told Bill Siddons, the Doors manager, before going, it's like, I don't know who I am anymore. And I'm going to go to Paris and get back to me and do some writing and also just kind of sober up. But when he went to Paris, he was on appeal. His case was on appeal. He was still on bond in Miami, and he was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor in what everyone was expecting if he lost on appeal to be sent to, which is the most notorious prison in Florida, Rayford Prison. To this day, that's a really violent place. And when Jim was in Paris, he kept asking his lawyers, like, hey, I want some kind of assurance that if I lose on the appeal, that I'm not going to get sent to Rayford Prison. And of course, his lawyers can't guarantee, nobody can guarantee him that at all. Mm-hmm. His lawyers kept telling him, listen, like, this case is pure bullshit. Like, you're going to get off on appeal. But, you're Jim Morrison. And I really had to walk with this person to understand a lot of these phases of his life. And when he's in Paris, you got to think, like, your lawyers are telling you that you're going to get off on appeal. Your case is garbage, and it's garbage because you didn't do what it was you're convicted of. But mm-hmm. you've already been nailed for it. You're a felon for something you didn't do. Robert Krieger said that they convicted him of something they didn't, and the one charge they did drop that he was guilty of, the misdemeanor, was public drunkenness. Like, he was drunk that night in Miami during that show. And plus, you're Jim Morrison. You know exactly what happens to people like you, spiritual secret teachers like yourself, when you run afoul of governments that want to shut you up because of the kind of spirituality that you're turning people onto, with your art. So Jim Morrison's going through his mind, like, what's going to happen to me if I go back to the United States? And he drank to deal with it. That was part of why he was drinking again. He was carrying on in the bars and cafes and screaming and yelling. And it feels like to me, when I read about these accounts, that he's losing his shit. He's losing his mind. He just doesn't know what to do with his life at this point. I mean, France doesn't have to this day an extradition treaty with the United States. So I guess you can make the argument that he probably maybe just should have stayed there. But Jim Morrison was not a cowardly person. That was out of the question. That's why Roman Polanski, the Polish film director, lives in France, because he has a warrant still here in Santa Monica from the whole statutory rape case. They can't take him out of France. So Jim Morrison could have done that, but he didn't. So I don't think Jim Morrison just disappeared. I think that would just be too difficult. I think what's in the arena of the truth is that when he died from this heroin overdose, that if they did an autopsy on his body and they found heroin, that would have resulted in the Parisian authorities opening up a murder investigation. A lot of people that night who were around Jim Morrison at the Rock and Roll Circus as he was hanging out, where a lot of people said that he was given heroin while he was drunk, they skipped the country. They left out of fear that they would be prosecuted by the courts of Paris for Jim Morrison's death. Also, Pamela did not tell the authorities that he had next of kin in the United States. So he died on July 3rd, and he was buried in Père Lachaise, on July 7th. It was very fast. There's only 5 people at the funeral. And I think people, either Pamela had this in her mind, or people were telling her, like, we need to wrap this up fast, or people are going to you can get into a lot of trouble. Because the whole heroin scene, Pamela was very much involved in. She was dating this French count, Jean de Breteuil, and he was dealing heroin. He was very rich. I mean, Jim Morrison detested all of that. So it's possible that he took heroin that night where he was really drunk. His system is already really abused from just the kind of lifestyle that he was living, and his body just couldn't take it at that point. This happened to Oscar Wilde, the English novelist. Mm-hmm. They put him in prison, for corrupting the youth of England with his books,
and for being homosexual, basically. Yeah,
right. And he went to Paris. Well, he was in prison for 2 years, and it was a disaster as far as his health. It really deteriorated his health. And he had the idea to go to Paris to get his life back together, get his health back, and he never recovered. And they buried him in Père Lachaise Cemetery. When Jim Morrison comes to Paris, Pamela went there before he did. They stayed for a while. First, they stayed in the Hotel Georges V, and then they moved into an apartment that they lived in temporarily before their other apartment was going to open up in the 4th arrondissement in the Marais district. And this apartment was the apartment where Oscar Wilde died. And, I know. I don't know if they knew that or not. I can't see Jim Morrison not knowing the history of the apartment that he's living in. And then just 3 months later, Jim Morrison joins Oscar Wilde in the same cemetery, trying to do the same thing that Oscar Wilde did when he came to Paris. But I just think the pressure of the fear of what would happen to Jim Morrison, of what he thought would happen to him if he was put into Rayford prison, was very heavy in his mind. I think that was the idea, was to get him into Rayford prison where he could easily be killed or easily be set up to be killed. I really think that that's what was going on. The same thing happened to Giordano Bruno, the Italian mathematician, occultist in the late 1500s. The Inquisition was after him. They didn't like his ideas about the spiritual world, and he kept telling people that there are other planets in the universe. Of course, he was proven right, exoplanets. And he left Italy, and he found patronage around Europe to, with other people that are very sympathetic and that they really liked him and they liked his work. And then he miscalculated. He thought that if he went back to Italy, that they would have forgotten about him or blown over, or they would just let it go. So he returns to Italy in 1592. He finds a patron in Venice. They have a falling out. Giordano Bruno, just like Jim Morrison, was a very rambunctious person with a very loud mouth that he could never shut up. And his patron reports him to the authorities in Venice. They arrest him. They hand him over to the Inquisition. He gets taken to Rome. The Pope throws him in prison for 6 to 7 years. And in 1600, the same year that the play Hamlet was debuted in London, they burned him at the stake. He miscalculated. And I think Jim Morrison, I couldn't find anything to say that Jim Morrison was familiar with Giordano Bruno's life, but I'm willing to bet that he probably was. And I'm sure Jim Morrison was thinking the same things, like what's gonna, do I stay here in France or do I go back to the United States and trust my lawyers that I'm going to win on appeal? But I really think Jim Morrison had the deep suspicion that the establishment was out not just to simply silence him, but to kill him.
Yeah, that's really heavy. And given the political climate of the times and what he faced, that you might not have been wrong, right?
Well, I mean, in Rayford prison, this is a really tough place, and walks in this Dionysian, rock performer who, Jim Morrison, he got into a lot of fights, not because he was a fighter, but because he had this idea where he just pushed it so much, just to see how far he could press people's buttons. There was a lot of fights that he could have avoided, a lot of beatings that he could have avoided, but he just wanted to see where it would go. And there's also something about getting beaten up and taking all of that pain that did something for him, that gave him some kind of a moral high ground of that he had to be able to take lots of pain in order to be who he was, like in some kind of strange spiritual sense, to be a healer, like to put up with it, as if is that all you got? I can take it. That kind of attitude. Like in the Doors movie, which there's a lot of problems with that. The one scene that Oliver Stone doesn't put in that movie is actually the one scene that says a lot about who Jim Morrison was. He gets arrested in New Haven, the first rock and roller ever arrested on stage. They take him back to the police station. And at the police station, in this scene, they're going to release him and all that. Jim Morrison just kept pestering and insulting the police officers, to the point where fuck you. And they just beat the shit out of him. And, Jim Morrison did that a lot. In the book, I also talk about an instance of Robbie Krieger where the Hells Angels are beating the shit out of him in a phone booth. And Robbie Krieger sees his face, Jim Morrison's face, pressed up against the glass, and he's smiling while they're beating the shit out of him. Bill Cosgrave says the same thing. He was arrested one night in Venice Beach, taunting the officers and pushing it. And they threw him into the back of that car and they beat the shit out of him. And Bill Cosgrave says the same thing. I could see him smiling when they took him away. It's very strange.
Yeah, man, it's too bad that he couldn't have gotten involved in the BDSM scene or something and found a way to have these urges satisfied, and maybe a way that wouldn't have been as destructive for his life.
Yes. And so in Rayford prison, he would have been the same kind of person there, and he probably knows, he probably has enough sense about who he is at that point, 26, 27 years old. He's like, God, I'm not going to make it out of that prison because they want to nail me. Plus there's who I am and all that. It's not going to work out. There is some explanation to this. I really think Jim Morrison's influenced by the film Lawrence of Arabia, which I talk about in my book. And there's a lot of similarities between T.E. Lawrence. He wrote The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, his account of leading the Arab Revolt in between 1916 and 1918, and Jim Morrison. And in the film, you see T.E. Lawrence, played by Peter O'Toole. There's a scene where they go into a Turkish village, which is the enemy, and he just allows himself just to be taken prisoner, by the Turkish Bey, played by Jose Ferrer. And he pushes it also because the Turkish Bey is gay, and he sees it. He wants to, he wants T.E. Lawrence, he wants Peter O'Toole, right, in the film. And then you see him in that film, like he kicks him in the nuts, and then the Turkish Bey is like, he says beat him, and after they beat him, they toss him out. And of course Omar Sharif's character, his close friend in the film, it's just he just can't understand why in the world he's allowing himself to be taken prisoner, by the Turks. Like they're going to find out, like he's Lawrence of Arabia, he's the one leading the revolt. Of course, they don't. I think Jim Morrison, that scene might have made an impression on him. I know for a fact that film made a deep impression on him. When I saw the film, I've loved this film my whole life. And then I saw it twice in 2017 at a film festival in Santa Monica. And that's when I thought to myself, when I was going through all my stuff with reading Secret Teachers of the Western World and making connections with Jim Morrison, that Jim Morrison saw this film also. There's so much about that movie that that you can find in Jim Morrison's lyrics. The whole story, who T.E. Lawrence was. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia comes out in 1962, and that film just kicks off the whole spirit of the 1960s. This is about someone who is a lieutenant, and they don't want to be stuck in this dull world anymore. Like they want to go and have an adventure out in the desert. And they come to this point, they become this great leader of the Arabs, and they're donning like this whole new outfit. And he completely shatters his identity. He totally becomes somebody else. And that made an impression on rock stars. David Bowie loved this film.
Yeah, yeah.
This is the same year that the Rolling Stones come out, in 1962. Bob Dylan's first album comes out in 1962. They both said that, with seeing Lawrence of Arabia, they got it in their minds that you could become somebody else if you allow yourself to go through what you have to go through to do it. And T. Lawrence in that film, he goes through all these things to earn the respect of the Bedouin tribes. And I think it would influence Jim Morrison in the same way. So as far as like that kind of like masochistic side of himself, getting beat up and all that, going through all that, I think he took that cue from T.E. Lawrence. I'm sure Jim Morrison read his book also, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which talks about those experiences when he was leading the Arab Revolt.
Yeah, man, there's a lot there. We could get down a whole rabbit hole about, taking on the identity and Bowie's work and all of the rest of it. This is something that's a big topic of interest of mine for sure. I'm looking at the clock here and I'm realizing I've taken up a lot of your time this afternoon. So thank you so much for hanging out.
I always love talking about it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. So is there anything that you would like to mention about Jim or about the book that I haven't asked you about?
I guess I would like to caution like all of your listeners that the connection that's going on in the culture right now regarding everything with MK Ultra and with music is like to really be discerning about this, because we're still learning about what was going on there in the 50s and 60s with what the CIA and the United States government was trying to do in creating like, human mind controlled assets. I think we have only scraped the surface of this. And there might be, more that comes out that maybe relates something to industry. I don't know. But to just really take all of that with a grain of salt as far as its connection with the music industry and with artists, because, Jim Morrison was a very creative person. And he really guarded his mind. He has statements like in his poetry, like, did you know that we're ruled by television? And he understood the power of the media. And he understood the power that it has to influence us in ways that are not good. So I guess just in general, just because MK Ultra is very sensational. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of people are, as far as conspiracy theories and like all these kinds of things, they're really fascinating rabbit holes. Right. Mm-hmm. And that can lead into, all these different places. And you start wondering about the effects on artists and everything like that. But Jim Morrison was someone who, to go back to what in the beginning of our conversation, Jim Morrison was someone who really took to heart that secret teacher's mission, to wake us up to that other reality that's been concealed from us, for a very long time. It coincided with not only the birth of rock music at that time, but that's the time when the world was experiencing in the 1960s the first popular occult awakening. And I think in any other time period, Jim Morrison and the Doors would not be nearly as popular. It all mysteriously coincided. Everybody was ready for Jim Morrison, this deeply mysterious person who was quite spiritual. So with Jim Morrison, he found this book in high school that we haven't talked about yet, The History of Magic and the Occult. And Jim Morrison says he also found a book on reptiles. And he said the first statement in that book on reptiles that really grabbed him. That the opening quote that Kurt Seligman chooses for The History of Magic and the Occult is a beautiful quote by Albert Einstein, in which says, "The fairest thing that we can experience is the mysterious." And I think that also really grabbed Jim Morrison's attention. He never returned this book to the library. He kept it and he gave it away years later to a friend at FSU in 1963. And it just, it turns out now Jim Morrison was one of the most, not the most, fairest, person that you can experience in rock music. And that's a cornerstone of mysticism and occultism, is that you're a person who's humbled by the mysteriousness of the natural world, the spiritual world, of the divine. And Jim Morrison was all about that. He put all of his faith, all of his whole life into things that were eternal.
Yeah, fuck yeah. I always give my guests a chance to ask me any questions if you have any.
Yeah, sure. So do you remember any other lines of his poetry that really like influence you and stick out to you, or that you find really beautiful, for you?
I think the song The End is absolutely haunting to me. I think that extended Apocalypse Now version of it was something that I listened to like a lot when I was younger, and I revisited a lot. And there's this sort of, these like kind of Freudian statements in there, like, "Mother, I want to fuck you. Father, I want to kill you." And it's just sort of like this way that he's really expressing himself without holding anything back in that piece. And I think that, yeah, that always really hit me really hard, is that extended Apocalypse Now version of The End is, I can hear it playing in my mind right now.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I have one artist friend. He loves Fellini, and his favorite Doors song is The End also. And he drew all these like pretty amazing connections between Fellini's film 8.5 with the Doors song The End too.
Yeah, right on. Well, where can people find your work?
I have a website, paulwyld.com, and all the links are there for how you can find the book. It came out in the UK last month, and it came out in Australia this month. So it's available these days. Like, it's easy, you can easily order it, and I've noticed it's been popping up, occult bookstores across the United States, which is pretty cool. Right so it's definitely readily available now.
Very cool. So do you have any last thoughts or some takeaway messages or lessons for listeners and I?
I'm very much aware of just how many people love Jim Morrison. When I was writing this book, I mean, I got in contact with a lot of really amazing writers, and sometimes I'm like, God, maybe they should be writing this book. But I told myself, no, you came up with this idea, and the divine is kind of choosing you to do this. So
you were given the work. Do the work, yes.
Yeah, exactly. I was given the work. So I guess, what I learned from all of this is with people like Jim Morrison and all these like really beautiful spiritual things that we're involved in, like whatever it is that you feel really strong that you want to express in relation to all of this, like go for it and just work hard, and the divine just guides you. Your spiritual guides will just guide you, and it's like for me it was like a flower that was just kind of blooming. Things just sort of happened at the right time. There are books that I needed to find that I mysteriously found, and it was a really beautiful experience. I could write a book about writing this book. So yeah, whatever it is, if you're a spiritual person going through a spiritual awakening, and you're an artist or you're a writer or anything like that, and you have things to say about these kinds of things, totally go for it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for hanging out today, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks so much to Paul Wyld for joining me. You can check the show notes to find link to Jim Morrison's Secret Teacher of the Occult, A Journey to the Other Side, and Paul's other work, including the song 123 California.
I wanted to mention that I actually found that book of Jim Morrison's writing, which I referenced in the conversation with Paul. It's called The Lost Writings of Jim Morrison, Wilderness, Volume 1, Poems and Diaries of a Rock and Roll Legend. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting little collection of like different rough poems, pieces, like little thoughts and stuff like that. It's very interesting. And yeah, this thing definitely had a big impact on me growing up. It was given to me by a friend who I was in a creative writing program with at the time. And yeah, so it was very cool and serendipitous to have rediscovered this book while I was producing this episode. So cheers.
There's a lot to think about in today's conversation for sure. Through one lens, Jim Morrison was a brilliant musician, ahead of his time, kind of visionary in some ways. He's also can be considered an abusive alcoholic who hurt those around him. Through another lens, he was a sort of lost person, maybe haunted by personal demons, or a haunted artist used badly by the fame his work garnered. And through another lens, he was on a mystic quest to transcend the limitations of the time and place he found himself in order to, as he said, break on through to the other side, and perhaps open that way for others to do likewise. None of these things, and all of these things, are true. Contain multitudes, right? I'll expand on this a little bit after listener mail, but first let me remind you that if you like the show and you like what we've got going on here, you can support it on Patreon, which will allow you to receive a Bibliomancy reading from me. And making this show is, of course, a pretty wild amount of work, especially for just one intrepid podcaster, but it means a lot to me to be able to do it. So thank you so much to the people who are making that possible by giving on Patreon or buy me a coffee, and the people who are supporting the show by spreading the word. Tell all of your friends, allies, and magical associates about it, as well as everybody you meet at the next PTA meeting, bake sale, anarchist collective coffee clutch, or ceremonial potluck you attend. You can also post about it on social media or write a positive review where that's possible. Both of these things are super helpful, so thank you so much to those of you who are doing so. And yes, don't forget to smash the fucking shit out of that follow button or alarm thing or whatever it is on the platform you use so that you can get new updates when an episode comes out. All right, let's do listener mail and shoutouts. Shout out to everybody supporting the show on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. There are some changes in my life going on that make the support mean all the more as demands in my time and energy increase. So thank you so much for allowing me to make Lux Occult podcast. Shout out and much love to all the pocket wizards. I'm constantly impressed and inspired by the interesting things you'll have going on magically. And I really appreciate the opportunities I've had to discuss social and philosophical type things with you all. For instance, even though I was really interested in talking to Paul Wyld today about Jim Morrison and the rest of it, I almost didn't do this interview because of the publishing company who printed the book. My distaste centered around the fact that they've put out some special fancy collector's editions by this historical author, Julius Evola, who's like this Nazi occultist who self-identified as a super fascist. I'm not into burning books or whatever, but there's like a difference between making historical texts available and enshrining and celebrating them the way this publisher seems to have done. It's also somewhat of a large clearinghouse type situation where a bunch of different stuff goes through and not like a boutique independent operation or whatever. Not mentioning any names here. Anyway, I brought up my concerns with the Pocket Wizards, and we had a really interesting and productive discussion about it. Thanks so much to everybody who chimed in on that. It was a really valuable thing to kind of parse out and look at, so I really appreciate it. Shout out to Caleb. Thanks for listening and for sharing your thoughts. Much appreciated. And shout out to everybody in Subversive Book Club. I'm not finding this second visit back to Sherry Tepper's Gate to Women's Country to be any less, like, disturbing or, like, it's really fucking me up, just as much as it did the first time. But it's nice to have some company along for the ride. There's things about it that are so haunting and so poignant and so, like, magically powerful, but there's also things about it that are so fucked up and troubling and, like, I don't know, yeah, so it's a lot to unpack, but nice to have company for that. Shout out to Zinipor, who reached out regarding the conversation I had with Tom Banger about the Temple of Psychic Youth. The topic of Freemasonry came up in that when Tom and I spoke, and Zed had this to share about his experiences with it. So he says, "Hey Luxa, I listened to episode 96 of the pod, and I wanted to challenge the assertion that a person needs to believe in Jesus in order to be a Mason. I can't speak for the Scottish Rite or Royal arc. Maybe there's some context that's specifically Christian in some of the Knights Templar stuff. They were crusaders after all. And the mysticism of the rose cross imagery seems vaguely Christian from the outside, but it should be clear that those are branches of Freemasonry and not the thing itself, if that makes sense. One needs to be a Mason to join those, but they're their own thing. Tom was right that Catholics are told by their Pope not to join Masonry. They don't like competing rituals. If a Catholic wants to join Freemasonry, they won't be turned away. Anyway, I just wanted to pop in and squelch that misconception. UK and North American Freemasonry have a lot of Christians. About half or a third of all Freemasons globally are in the US, but it's not a specifically Christian organization. There are a couple of Bible story references in the ritual, but nothing about Jesus, mostly about the building of King Solomon's temple. Maybe some Graton lodges aren't as inclusive as where I am. I guess maybe some places are less open to people of different faiths, but typically we don't talk about religion at all, and a belief in a supreme being is all that's required. Like in the 12-step program, what a person believes about their higher powers between them and their creator. This is supposed to be one of the universal tenets of the craft that all religions are accepted. All right, hell yeah, thank you so much, Ed, for chiming in about that. It's always interesting to hear about people's experiences with these organizations. And yes, as you noted, there's a lot of complexity there and a lot to kind of unpack. So thank you so much for sharing about that. Fuck yeah. If you'd like to send me thoughts, questions, comments, or arcane revelations or suggestions, you can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com. For the time being, on Instagram @luxoccultpod. Or on Blue Sky Social @Luxastrata, LUXASTRATA. Thanks so much to everybody who has reached out and who's been supporting the show by rating, reviewing, and giving on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Know that whether or not it was featured, all of the missives I receive are appreciated and treasured, whether or not they make it to the listener mailbag. There's a lot of administrative work that can go into like keeping track of all that stuff. So I do my best with it, but it is not always the case that I include all of the things I would like to include. Anyway, getting back to thinking about Jim Morrison here, there are a few takeaway points that I wanted to revisit. I think that we all have our own Jimbo. This is sort of what shadow work is about, so this isn't like a weird idea or anything. Our Jimbos might not be violent or abusive people. They might operate in more subtle ways. They might be more like doormats or people pleasers or whatever. But I wonder what things would have been like for Jim Morrison if he would have been able to overcome his Jimbo, if he would have had the support and resources that he would have needed to do so. As Paul explained earlier, there just wasn't a lot of help for people struggling back then with problematic substance use or the underlying causes that can, be behind it, like trauma and stuff like that. A thing that comes up for me often in my ancestor or necromancy work, and Jim Morrison is certainly a spiritual or artistic ancestor to many, a thing that comes up for me has to do with, what things might have been like for my ancestors if only some of them had access to the tools that are available to us now. And I think this is like a really good example of that. It really motivates me to do right by my ancestors, to try to like push things further than they were able to in their time. And I hope that someday I will inspire others to do likewise in the future. And I'm sure this is not a unique thing. I'm guessing that this is something that we all want for ourselves, and probably something that we will all in some ways achieve. Another point which I'd like to briefly revisit has to do with Jim Morrison's understanding of how media can be used as a tool for manipulation. He studied film, and he probably had a pretty intuitive grasp of this, maybe as an artist. And he really was of the opinion that you should guard your mind, and I'd like to echo this. Hopefully you'll hear this episode in the future, and things will be more chill and awesome. We'll see how it goes, right? But as the time of recording this, there's recently been a regime change in the US, which has brought with it a whole torrent of troubling bullshit. The inability to process all of what's happening is by design and could be contextualized as a sort of psyop that is being conducted against the US population by its new government. Finding ways to guard your mind is not only magically important when it comes to psychic self-defense and other types of things like that, including some types of banishing, it can also have a huge impact on morale. The importance of morale, our ability to believe we can win a battle, and our resilience to keep fighting that battle. And a battle doesn't have to mean violence or anything like that. It can mean a lot of different things, but the importance of morale cannot be underestimated. So, guard your minds, friends. A quick reminder. The last thing I wanted to touch on has to do with what it means to be a rock star. Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth said that people go to rock shows to see people who really believe in themselves. And I think that what's sort of being said here is that being yourself like as hard as you can is how to become a rock star. So I will now share the Green Mushroom Project statement of resistance with you as I remind you to be yourself as hard as you fucking can, because you already are a rock star. Resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of the self. Resist by maintaining love of the self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah. Thanks so much to Paul Wyld for joining me, and thanks so much for all the kind words and support for the show and my other work. Appreciate it, y'all. There's all kinds of cool stuff on the horizon. Super stoked about it. Some very fun content coming your way, including a special Valentine's Day panel. We're going to talk about magic and mental health and more. Stoked to share that with you all. Gratitude from the help from both seen and unseen sources. Thank you, Wyld and Hail Hecate. And most of all, thanks so much to you for listening. Much love. This is Lux Estrada, reminding you to stay strong and stay fucking curious. And guard your mind. Cheers.
Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.